The cargo plane shuddered violently as it descended through the storm, its left engine trailing black smoke across the darkening Nevada sky. Inside the cockpit, Captain Torres gripped the controls with white knuckles, his voice crackling with panic over the radio as he fought to maintain altitude. The aircraft, carrying 43 wounded soldiers from an overseas medical evacuation, was losing power fast, and the nearest military airfield was still 30 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain. Emergency vehicles raced across the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base as controllers frantically coordinated what seemed like an impossible rescue mission. Then, cutting through the chaos of radio chatter and emergency protocols, came a voice that made everyone in the control tower freeze. Clear, steady, and impossibly calm, it guided Captain Torres through a series of maneuvers that defied every textbook emergency procedure. The voice belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who wasn't supposed to know these frequencies, someone who certainly wasn't supposed to possess the kind of expertise that was now saving 43 lives in real time. As the massive cargo plane touched down safely on the auxiliary runway in what would later be called the most technically perfect emergency landing in military aviation history, Captain Torres stumbled out of the cockpit, his legs shaking from adrenaline and relief. Who was that? He gasped into his headset, looking around wildly. Who was my guardian angel out there? That voice ... wasn't air traffic control. That was something else entirely. Whoever you are, you just saved us. All. The control tower erupted in confused murmurs as operators checked and double-checked their systems. No unauthorized transmissions had been logged. No off-duty pilots were supposed to have access to emergency frequencies. Yet someone had just executed a textbook emergency guidance protocol with a level of precision that suggested decades of experience. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, stared at the monitoring equipment with growing bewilderment. Every official channel showed normal operations, yet they had all heard the mysterious voice that had somehow taken control of the emergency landing procedure. It was then that Senior Airman Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed communications specialist who had been monitoring backup frequencies, noticed something that made his blood run cold. He pulled up the transmission logs on his secondary console, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he traced the source of those life-saving instructions. The signal had originated from inside the base, but not from any authorized location. It had come from the old maintenance hangar, a mostly abandoned facility that housed outdated equipment and served as storage for decommissioned aircraft parts. "Sir," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with confusion and something approaching. The transmission. It came from Hangar 7, but that's impossible. There's no active radio equipment in there. Hell, there's barely electricity in that building." Colonel Martinez felt a chill run down his spine as he processed this information. Hangar 7 had been essentially mothballed for the better part of a decade, used only for storing old parts and occasionally housing maintenance overflow. No one had any business being in there during an emergency, and certainly no one should have had access to radio, equipment capable of overriding primary communication systems. Yet someone had not only been there, but had possessed the kind of expertise and authority to take command of a life-or-death situation. "Rodriguez, pull the security footage from that sector immediately," Martinez ordered, his mind racing through possibilities. "I want to know who was in that hangar and how. They got access to communication equipment that shouldn't even exist." As the security team prepared to investigate Hangar 7, word of the miraculous emergency landing was already spreading throughout the base. The cargo plane had been carrying soldiers wounded in a training accident at a forward operating base. Men and women whose injuries required immediate medical attention that could only be provided at the advanced facilities at Nellis. The storm had made a routine medical evacuation into a nightmare scenario, with visibility near zero and crosswinds that had already forced 2 other aircraft to divert to alternate airfields. Captain Torres Still shaken from his ordeal, was adamant in his debriefing that the mysterious voice had saved not just his aircraft, but the lives of everyone aboard. "Whoever that was knew things about emergency procedures that I've never heard before," he told the gathered officers. "They walked me through maneuvers that aren't in any manual I've ever read. It was like having a master pilot sitting right beside me, someone with experience I can't even begin to imagine." What did you think of this thrilling journey? Share your favorite moment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest tales. What kind of story would you like to hear next? The wounded soldiers were quickly transferred to the base medical facility. Their evacuation now complete, thanks to the intervention of someone whose identity remained a complete mystery. Medical personnel worked efficiently to stabilize the injured, unaware that their patients owed their lives to a voice in the darkness, someone who had emerged from the shadows of an abandoned hangar to perform what military historians would later classify as one of the most technically brilliant emergency interventions in modern aviation history. As night fell over Nellis Air Force Base, the questions only multiplied. Security footage from the perimeter showed no unauthorized personnel entering Hangar 7. The building's electrical systems had been partially shut down for months, yet someone had somehow accessed enough power to operate sophisticated radio equipment. More puzzling still, the voice that had guided Captain Torres had demonstrated a level of technical knowledge and command authority that suggested extensive military flight experience, yet no active duty pilot on the base had been in that location. Colonel Martinez stood in his office, staring out at the distant lights of Hangar 7, feeling like he was dealing with something that defied logical explanation. In his 25 years of military service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. Someone with extraordinary piloting expertise had materialized from an abandoned building to save 43 lives, then vanished back into obscurity. Without seeking recognition or even acknowledgement, the investigation would begin at first light. But already Martinez suspected that unraveling this mystery would lead him into territory he wasn't prepared for. The voice that had saved Captain Torres and his passengers had carried an authority and competence that came only from years of high-level flight experience, yet it had emerged from a location where no such person should have been. As he prepared his initial reports for higher command, Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was just the tip of an iceberg, the first glimpse of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the people serving under his command. The storm that had threatened to claim 43 lives was beginning to clear, but the mystery it had revealed was just beginning to unfold. Maya Santos had always been invisible at Nellis Air Force Base, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Every morning at 0530, she would arrive at the maintenance depot in her faded olive drab coveralls, her black hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had seen better days, carrying a thermos of coffee that had gone cold during her 40-minute drive from her small apartment off base. At 32, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate military bureaucracy without drawing attention, her slight frame and soft-spoken demeanor allowing her to blend seamlessly into the background of the sprawling installation. Her official designation was Aircraft Maintenance Specialist, Grade E4, a position that placed her firmly in the middle ranks of the enlisted hierarchy. Maya's daily routine involved inspecting aircraft components, updating maintenance logs, and ensuring that spare parts were properly cataloged and stored. It was meticulous work that required attention to detail, but offered little opportunity for advancement or recognition. She approached each task with methodical precision, completing her assignments efficiently before most of her colleagues had even finished their first cup of coffee. What set Maya apart from her peers wasn't immediately obvious to casual observers. While other maintenance personnel gathered around coffee machines to complain about duty rosters and discuss weekend plans, Maya would often be found studying technical manuals that seemed far above her pay grade. She had an uncanny ability to diagnose mechanical problems that stumped more senior technicians, offering quiet suggestions that inevitably proved correct. Her supervisors had learned to value her input, though they rarely publicly acknowledged her contributions. Staff Sergeant Williams, her immediate supervisor, had initially been skeptical of the quiet woman who seemed more interested in reading aircraft specifications than socializing with her fellow airmen. Over the past 3 years, however, he had come to rely on Maya's insights more than he cared to admit. She had an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that went far beyond what her training should have provided, an almost mystical ability to identify problems before they became critical failures. "Santos has a gift," Williams would tell other supervisors during their weekly coordination meetings. "I don't know where she learned half the stuff she knows, but that woman can spot a potential failure from across a hangar bay. Hell, sometimes I think she knows more about these birds than the pilots who fly them." Maya's colleagues had mixed reactions to her unusual competence. Some respected her expertise and sought her advice when dealing with particularly challenging maintenance issues. Others resented what they perceived as showing off, muttering that she was trying too hard to impress the brass. Most simply accepted her as part of the landscape, the quiet specialist who always seemed to know what needed to be done. Despite her technical proficiency, Maya had never expressed any interest in pursuing advancement opportunities. She had declined suggestions that she apply for technical school, showing no enthusiasm for leadership positions or specialized training programs that could have accelerated her career. When asked about her long-term goals, she would offer vague responses about being content with her current role, deflecting further inquiry with a shy smile and a change of subject. Her living quarters reflected this deliberate simplicity. Maya's on-base room was spartanly furnished, containing only the essentials plus a small collection of technical books that she read during her off hours. She had no decorations, no personal photographs, nothing that revealed anything about her life before joining the Air Force. Her fellow airmen knew virtually nothing about her background, her family, or her reasons for enlisting. The mystery of Maya Santos extended to her interactions with aircraft themselves. Maintenance crews had noticed that she seemed to have an almost supernatural connection to the machines she worked on. She could detect subtle vibrations that indicated impending mechanical failure, identify unusual sounds that others couldn't even hear, and somehow predict which components would need replacement before standard inspection schedules called for it. Her maintenance logs were legendary for their accuracy and completeness. What truly puzzled her colleagues was Maya's behavior around active flight operations. While other maintenance personnel would pause to watch aircraft takeoffs and landings with casual interest, Maya would become completely absorbed, her eyes tracking every movement with an intensity that seemed almost hungry. She would unconsciously mouth corrections to pilots' techniques, her hands making subtle control movements as if she were sitting in the cockpit herself. When aircraft experienced even minor difficulties during landing approaches, Maya would tense visibly, her breathing becoming shallow as she watched with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening. During night shifts, when the maintenance depot was largely empty, Maya would often be found in areas of the hangar where she had no official business. Security guards had grown accustomed to finding her in observation areas overlooking the flight line, watching late-night training exercises with the same intense focus she brought to her maintenance work. When questioned about these unauthorized wanderings, she would apologize quietly and return to her assigned areas, but the pattern would inevitably repeat itself. Her technical knowledge extended far beyond what her position required. Maya could discuss advanced aerodynamics, complex navigation systems, and emergency procedures with a depth of understanding that surprised even veteran pilots. During informal conversations, she would occasionally offer insights into flight operations that demonstrated a comprehensive grasp of aviation principles that should have taken years of formal training to develop. When pressed about where she had acquired such knowledge, she would become evasive, claiming to have read extensively during her spare time. The few personal details that Maya had shared with her colleagues painted a picture of someone seeking to disappear into military routine. She had mentioned growing up in rural New Mexico, though she was vague about specifics. She had no apparent family connections, received no personal mail, and never took leave time to visit anyone. Her background check had been routine, revealing nothing more interesting than a series of civilian jobs in aircraft maintenance at small regional airports. What her colleagues didn't know was that Maya Santos spent her evenings in ways that would have astonished them. In her small apartment, she maintained detailed charts of local weather patterns, tracked commercial and military flight schedules, and monitored emergency frequencies with equipment that far exceeded what an E-4 maintenance specialist should have been able to afford or operate. She had converted her spare bedroom into an unofficial command center, complete with radio equipment, navigation charts, and reference materials that would have been impressive in a professional pilot's study. Maya's relationship with her work went far beyond professional duty. Every aircraft she maintained represented something precious to her, a connection to dreams that she carried but never discussed. She would spend extra time on routine inspections, ensuring that every system was optimized, every component functioning at peak efficiency. Her fellow maintenance workers joked that Maya treated the aircraft like they were her own children, but they didn't understand how close to the truth that observation really was. The isolation that Maya had built around herself served a specific purpose. She had learned that anonymity was a form of protection, that drawing attention inevitably led to questions she couldn't answer. Her quiet competence allowed her to remain useful without becoming prominent, valuable enough to be retained, but not significant enough to warrant scrutiny. It was a delicate balance that she had maintained successfully for 3 years. As she went about her daily routines, Maya carried knowledge and skills that would have amazed her colleagues. Hidden beneath her unassuming exterior was a depth of aviation expertise that represented years of training and experience that she couldn't acknowledge. She had learned to suppress the instincts and capabilities that had once defined her, channeling them into maintenance work that kept her connected to aircraft without revealing the full extent of her abilities. The approaching storm that would change everything was still hours away, but Maya Santos was already unconsciously preparing for something she couldn't yet name. Her evening routine would take her to places she wasn't supposed to be, driven by instincts she had spent years trying to ignore. The quiet maintenance specialist who had become invisible through careful design was about to discover that some purposes cannot be denied forever. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came at 1847 hours, when the emergency alert system at Nellis Air Force Base began broadcasting a priority distress signal that made every controller in the tower sit up straighter. Flight Mercy 7 Alpha, AC-130 Hercules transport aircraft, conducting a routine medical evacuation from Kandahar Airfield, had encountered what the pilot described as catastrophic weather conditions over the mountainous terrain of eastern Nevada. The aircraft was carrying 43 wounded soldiers, their injuries ranging from blast trauma to severe burns, all requiring immediate access to the advanced trauma facilities that only Nellis could provide. Captain Alana Torres, the aircraft commander, had been flying military transports for 8 years, but she had never encountered weather conditions quite like what was developing around her aircraft. What had started as a routine flight plan through relatively calm airspace had deteriorated rapidly as an unexpected storm system moved in from the west, bringing with it winds that were clocking sustained speeds of over 60 knots with gusts approaching 80. The meteorological reports had completely failed to predict the intensity of the system, leaving Torres and her crew flying blind into conditions that were testing the limits of both their aircraft and their training. Nellis Tower, this is Mercy 7 Alpha. Torres transmitted, her voice tight with concentration as she fought to maintain level flight. "We are encountering severe turbulence and wind shear. Request immediate priority approach clearance. We have critical medical cargo aboard, and fuel reserves are becoming a concern." The response from air traffic control was immediate but not reassuring. Due to the unexpected severity of the storm, 2 other aircraft had already been forced to divert to alternate airfields. The winds at Nellis were gusting beyond safe landing parameters for most aircraft, and visibility had dropped to near zero as sheets of rain swept across the high desert installation. Emergency crews were standing by, but the conditions were so severe that even rescue operations would be severely hampered if anything went wrong during the approach. Air traffic controller Sarah Martinez had been managing aircraft operations at Nellis for over a decade, but the situation developing on her radar scope was unlike anything she had encountered before. The storm system was intensifying far more rapidly than predicted, creating wind patterns that were shifting minute by minute. The C-130 carrying the wounded soldiers was flying into conditions that would challenge even the most experienced crews, and Martinez knew that the margin for error was becoming dangerously thin. Mercy 7 Alpha, the advised current winds at Nellis are 270 at 45 gusting to 70. Visibility 1/4 mile in heavy rain. Recommend you consider diversion to Creech or McCarran, where conditions may be more favorable, Martinez transmitted. Though she knew that the fuel situation might not allow for such alternatives, Captain Torres checked her fuel gauges again, confirming what she already suspected. The unexpected headwinds had consumed more fuel than planned, and her reserves were cutting dangerously close to minimum requirements. More critically, several of the wounded soldiers in the cargo bay were in conditions that required immediate surgical intervention. Diverting to another airfield would add precious time that some of her passengers simply didn't have. Negative on the diversion, Nellis. We have multiple critical casualties aboard who cannot wait for transport to alternate facilities. We are declaring a medical emergency and requesting immediate approach clearance regardless of conditions. We're coming in whether you clear us or not. The declaration sent ripples of tension through the control tower. Medical emergency status gave Torres priority over all other air traffic, but it also meant that everyone involved was now committed to an approach that pushed far beyond normal safety parameters. Emergency vehicles began rolling toward the runway as ground crews prepared for what could easily become a disaster scenario. In the cargo bay of Mercy 7 Alpha, Flight Nurse Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh was fighting her own battle against the increasingly violent turbulence. The wounded soldiers strapped to stretchers were being thrown about despite the restraint systems, and several of the most critically injured were showing signs of deteriorating vital signs that correlated directly with the stress of the rough flight. Walsh had requested sedation for some patients, but even keeping 4 lines secure was becoming nearly impossible as the aircraft bucked and rolled through the storm. "Captain," Walsh called forward on the intercom, "I've got 3 patients here whose conditions are critical. Any additional delay is going to cost lives. Whatever you have to do to get us on the ground, do it now." Torres acknowledged the transmission while wrestling with controls that seemed to have developed a mind of their own. The C-130 was a robust aircraft designed to operate in challenging conditions, but the wind shear was creating lift variations that made maintaining stable flight increasingly difficult. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, was calling out airspeed and altitude readings that varied wildly from second to second as they fought their way through the storm. The situation deteriorated further when Torres received an update from Nellis Approach Control that made her stomach clench with dread. The storm was intensifying beyond all predictions, with radar showing wind patterns that were creating microbursts and downdrafts across the primary runway approach path. 2 civilian aircraft had already declared emergencies and diverted to alternate airports, leaving the airspace around Nellis essentially clear but also meaning that Torres would be attempting her landing without the benefit of other aircraft to provide real-time wind condition reports. Mercy 7 Alpha, be advised we are showing severe wind shear alerts across all approach corridors. Recommend you hold at current position until conditions improve, came the transmission from approach control, though the controller's voice carried little confidence that conditions would improve anytime soon. Torres looked at her fuel gauges one more time and made a decision that would either save 43 lives or end them all. Negative approach control. We are beginning our descent now. Clear all other traffic from the area and have emergency crews standing by. We're coming in hard and fast, and we're only going to get one chance at this. The descent through the storm was a nightmare of violent turbulence and zero visibility. Torres found herself flying entirely on instruments as rain hammered the windscreen and lightning illuminated the cockpit in stroboscopic flashes. The aircraft was being thrown around like a toy, with vertical acceleration forces that made it impossible for anyone aboard to maintain normal position. In the cargo bay, Lieutenant Walsh was now fighting to keep critically injured soldiers from suffering additional trauma as the stretchers strained against their mounting points. As Mercy 7 Alpha descended through 8,000 feet, Torres encountered the full fury of the wind shear that had been predicted. The aircraft suddenly dropped nearly 300 feet in a matter of seconds, the altimeters spinning as the C-130 fell through a downdraft that felt like hitting a brick wall. Torres managed to arrest the descent, but not before the violent motion had triggered several medical alarms in the cargo bay as injured soldiers' vital signs spiked in response to the trauma. Engine troubles developing on number 2, Lieutenant Johnson reported. His voice strained as he monitored the engine instruments. Oil pressure is fluctuating and EGT is climbing. We may need to shut it down. The loss of an engine during an emergency approach in severe weather conditions was a scenario that pushed far beyond routine emergency procedures. Torres realized that she was now facing a situation that required not just excellent piloting skills, but also the kind of innovative thinking that came only from extensive experience with crisis management. The standard approaches and procedures that had been drilled into her during flight training were inadequate for the combination of challenges she was now facing. Nellis Tower, Mercy 7 Alpha, is now experiencing engine problems in addition to weather difficulties. We are approximately 15 miles out and will require immediate emergency response upon landing. Be advised we may not be able to execute a standard approach profile. The emergency declaration upgraded the situation to the highest priority level, with every available resource at Nellis being mobilized to support the incoming aircraft. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment were positioning along the runway, while medical personnel at the base hospital prepared to receive multiple critical casualties. The stakes were clear to everyone involved, 43 wounded. Soldiers were depending on a successful landing that was looking increasingly unlikely with each passing minute. As Torres fought to maintain control of her aircraft while descending through conditions that would have grounded most flights, she began to realize that conventional approach procedures might not be sufficient. The wind patterns were too chaotic, the visibility too poor, and the aircraft too compromised to rely on standard techniques. She was going to need help from someone with experience beyond what normal training provided, guidance from someone who understood how to navigate impossible situations, unknown to Torres. That help was already preparing to manifest itself in ways that no one at Nellis Air Force Base could have anticipated. The Emergency Coordination Center at Nellis Air Force Base had transformed into a hive of frantic activity as reports from Mercy 7 Alpha grew increasingly dire. Colonel David Martinez stood at the center of the operations hub, surrounded by controllers, meteorologists, and emergency response coordinators who were all struggling to develop a solution for an aircraft that seemed destined for disaster. The latest transmission from Captain Torres had included the ominous news that her number 2 engine was now showing clear signs of imminent failure. Adding mechanical crisis to the already overwhelming weather emergency, Maya Santos had been monitoring the situation from her maintenance station, listening to the radio chatter with growing alarm as she realized the full scope of what was developing. The wounded soldiers aboard that aircraft were facing a combination of circumstances that would challenge even the most experienced emergency response teams, and from what she could hear in the transmissions, the standard protocols were proving inadequate for the severity of the crisis. Her hands had unconsciously tightened around the radio headset she used for maintenance coordination, and she found herself unconsciously calculating approach vectors and emergency procedures that weren't part of her official training. When Maya heard Colonel Martinez announce that they were going to attempt to guide Captain Torres through a modified emergency approach using weather radar data and ground-based navigation assistance, she felt her heart sink. The approach they were describing would never work in the current conditions. The wind shear patterns were too complex, the visibility too poor, and the aircraft too compromised to rely on conventional guidance systems. She could hear in Torres's transmissions that the pilot was already overwhelmed by the combination of factors she was facing, and the additional complexity of an untested approach procedure would likely push the situation beyond recovery. Without fully conscious thought, Maya found herself walking toward the operations center, driven by an instinct that she had spent years suppressing. She approached the periphery of the emergency coordination area, watching as senior officers debated approach options that she knew would fail. The mathematical calculations required for the kind of precision approach that Torres needed were complex enough under normal conditions, but with the added variables of severe weather and mechanical failure, the standard procedures were simply inadequate. "Sir," Maya said quietly, stepping forward toward Colonel Martinez's position, "I think there might be an alternative approach that could work better under these conditions." The colonel looked up from the radar display he had been studying, his expression showing a mixture of stress and irritation at being interrupted by someone who clearly didn't belong in the emergency coordination center. Maya was wearing her standard maintenance coveralls, her appearance marking her as support personnel rather than flight operations staff. In the midst of a life-or-death crisis involving 43 wounded soldiers, Martinez had no patience for input from maintenance technicians. "Specialist Santos, isn't it?" Martinez said, glancing at her name tape before returning his attention to the radar display. "I appreciate your concern, but we have experienced flight operations personnel handling this situation. Emergency approach procedures are complex matters that require extensive training and certification to understand properly. You should return to your maintenance duties and let the qualified personnel manage this crisis." Maya felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but the lives at stake made it impossible for her to simply walk away. She could see on the radar displays that Torres was attempting an approach that would take her directly through the most severe wind shear zone, a path that would almost certainly result in catastrophic loss of control. The emergency response team was focused on providing guidance based on standard procedures, but those procedures had been developed for normal conditions, not for the combination of severe weather and mechanical failure that Torres was facing. "Colonel, with respect, the approach vector you're planning will take that aircraft through a microburst zone that's showing sustained downdrafts of over 2,000 feet per minute," Maya said, pointing to the weather radar display. "At her current airspeed and with engine troubles, she won't have enough power to recover from that kind of descent rate." Senior Controller Martinez, who had been coordinating the emergency response, looked up from his communications console with obvious irritation. "Specialist, emergency approach procedures are not maintenance issues. Captain Torres is an experienced pilot with hundreds of hours in C-130 aircraft. She doesn't need navigation advice from someone whose job is changing engine filters." The dismissive tone was echoed by several other officers in the coordination center, who were clearly uncomfortable with a junior enlisted person questioning the emergency procedures being developed by senior flight operations personnel. Major Wilson, the deputy operations officer, stepped forward with a stern expression that made clear his displeasure with Maya's continued presence in the emergency center. "Santos, you're out of line here," Wilson said firmly. "This is a complex flight emergency requiring expertise in advanced navigation and emergency procedures. Unless you have pilot training and certification that I'm not aware of, you need to step back and let the qualified personnel handle this situation. Return to your maintenance station immediately." Maya looked around the room at the faces of officers who saw her as nothing more than an enlisted maintenance worker who had overstepped her bounds. The dismissal was complete and absolute, reinforced by military hierarchy and the assumption that technical knowledge was compartmentalized according to military occupational specialties. In their minds, a maintenance specialist could not possibly possess the kind of advanced flight knowledge required to contribute meaningfully to emergency approach procedures. "I understand your concerns about jurisdiction," Maya said, making one final attempt to communicate the urgency of what she was seeing. "But the weather patterns are creating conditions that aren't covered in standard emergency procedures. The approach you're planning assumes normal atmospheric conditions, but the radar is showing wind patterns that will create impossible recovery situations." Colonel Martinez turned away from Maya completely, directing his attention to the senior controllers, who were coordinating with Captain Torres. "Controller Martinez, continue with the planned approach guidance. Have Torres begin her descent on the standard emergency approach vector and maintain constant communication about wind conditions. We don't have time for theoretical discussions about alternative procedures." The finality of the dismissal was unmistakable, reinforced by the body language of every officer in the room, who had made clear that Maya's input was neither wanted nor valued. She was being treated as an enlisted person who had forgotten her place in the military hierarchy, someone whose technical knowledge was limited to maintenance procedures and who had no business offering opinions about flight operations. The assumption that expertise was rigidly defined by military occupational specialty made it impossible for them to consider that someone in maintenance might possess knowledge relevant to emergency flight procedures. Maya stood for a moment longer, watching as the emergency coordination team began implementing an approach procedure that she knew would fail catastrophically. Torres was about to be guided into a situation that would likely result in the loss of all 43 wounded soldiers aboard her aircraft, and there was nothing Maya could say or do to prevent it within the constraints of military protocol. Her warnings had been dismissed as the uninformed opinions of someone who didn't understand the complexities of flight operations. As she walked slowly toward the exit of the Emergency Coordination Center, Maya could hear Captain Torres beginning her descent according to the guidance being provided by the tower. The pilot's voice carried the strain of someone who was pushing far beyond her normal comfort zone, but who was following orders from ground control because she had no alternative source of guidance. The standard emergency procedures were being applied to a non-standard situation, with results that Maya could predict with mathematical precision. The dismissal she had experienced was complete and humiliating, but it was also familiar. Throughout her military service, Maya had learned that questioning established procedures or offering insights that exceeded expected knowledge boundaries inevitably resulted in professional isolation. The assumption that expertise was limited by rank and military occupational specialty made it impossible for her to contribute knowledge that could save lives without revealing capabilities that she was not supposed to possess. Walking back toward the maintenance area, Maya realized that she was facing a choice that would define not just her own future, but the fate of 43 wounded soldiers who were depending on guidance that was about to fail them catastrophically. The emergency coordination team had made clear that her input was unwanted, and that any further interference would be viewed as insubordination. But Maya also knew that within minutes, Captain Torres would encounter conditions that would overwhelm both her aircraft and her training. Conditions that could only be navigated with guidance that exceeded standard emergency procedures. The weight of that knowledge, combined with the absolute certainty of what would happen if she did nothing, began to override the years of careful anonymity that had defined her military service. Maya Santos walked away from the Emergency Coordination Center, with her mind racing, but her destination was already clear. The dismissal she had just experienced was absolute, but the lives of 43 wounded soldiers hung in the balance, and she possessed knowledge that could mean the difference between their survival and catastrophic loss. As she moved through the corridors of the operations building, she could hear Captain Torres beginning her descent according to the guidance being provided by the control tower, following an approach vector that Maya knew with mathematical certainty would lead to disaster. The old maintenance hangar that housed decommissioned equipment and spare parts was normally locked after 1800 hours, but Maya had learned years ago how to access areas of the base that were officially off limits. Her maintenance credentials provided her with keys to storage areas throughout Nellis, and the abandoned sections of Hangar 7 contained equipment that most personnel had forgotten existed. As she approached the weathered metal building, Maya could feel the weight of a decision that would irrevocably change her carefully constructed anonymous existence. Inside Hangar 7, dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through grimy windows, illuminating rows of covered aircraft parts and obsolete maintenance equipment. Maya moved with purpose through the maze of stored materials, heading toward a section of the building that contained communications equipment that had been retired from active service but never actually removed. Hidden beneath canvas tarps and layers of accumulated neglect was a complete radio communication station, vintage equipment from an earlier era of military aviation that still functioned despite its official obsolescence. The radio equipment Maya uncovered represented technology from a time when aviation communication required more manual skill and technical understanding than modern automated systems. These were vacuum tube radios that required precise tuning and detailed knowledge of frequency characteristics, equipment that could access communication bands that newer digital systems couldn't reach. More importantly, these radios could transmit on emergency frequencies that were monitored but not actively controlled by modern air traffic management systems. Maya's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she powered up the old equipment, her movements reflecting familiarity that went far beyond what a maintenance specialist should have possessed. She adjusted frequency dials with precision that suggested years of experience, tuning into communication bands that were used primarily for backup emergency communications. The vacuum tubes glowed to life with a warm amber light as the radio system came online, connecting her to the same airspace where Captain Torres was fighting for the lives of her passengers. Through the static and interference of the old equipment, Maya could hear the ongoing communication between Torres and Nellis Tower. The pilot was reporting increasing difficulty maintaining stable flight as she descended through the storm, her voice tight with concentration as she fought against wind conditions that were exceeding all predictions. The guidance she was receiving from air traffic control was technically correct according to standard procedures, but Maya could hear in Torres transmissions that the approach was already pushing beyond the aircraft's capabilities. Maya waited until Torres was at the most critical point of her approach, the moment when the wind shear patterns would create conditions that no amount of standard guidance could overcome. Then, with a calmness that surprised even herself, she keyed the microphone and began transmitting on a frequency that she knew Torres would be monitoring as part of emergency backup procedures. Mercy 7 Alpha, this is emergency guidance backup. On frequency 243.0, Captain Torres, you need to abort your current approach immediately. You are descending into a microburst zone that will create unrecoverable downdrafts. Acknowledge if you copy this transmission. The response was immediate and filled with confusion. Emergency guidance backup. This is Mercy 7 Alpha. Who is this? I'm not showing your frequency on my authorized communications list. Tower is directing me to continue current approach. Maya had expected this reaction, but she also knew that Torres was about to encounter conditions that would make theoretical concerns about communication protocols irrelevant. The radar data she had seen in the Emergency Coordination Center showed wind patterns that were intensifying beyond anything in the meteorological forecasts, creating a situation that required immediate action rather than procedural compliance. Captain Torres, disregard tower communications for the next 60 seconds and listen carefully. I am transmitting weather data that shows severe wind shear directly ahead of your position. You need to execute an immediate right turn to heading 090 and climb to 8,000 feet. The approach vector you're currently following will take you through downdrafts that exceed your aircraft's recovery capability. Through the crackling static of the old radio, Maya could hear Torres struggling with a decision that violated every protocol of military aviation. Following guidance from an unauthorized source during an emergency approach was essentially unthinkable. Yet the mysterious voice was providing specific technical information that suggested access to weather data and navigation capabilities beyond what standard air traffic control possessed. Emergency guidance. I need verification of your authority and access to current weather data. Tower is showing me clear for approach on current heading. Maya realized that she had reached the point where half measures would no longer suffice. Torres needed guidance that exceeded standard emergency procedures, and providing that guidance would require Maya to reveal capabilities that she had spent years concealing. The lives of 43 wounded soldiers depended on her willingness to abandon the anonymity that had protected her for so long. Captain Torres, execute right turn to 090 immediately. I am tracking your position on independent radar and can see conditions that your tower cannot detect. Trust me for the next 10 minutes, and I will guide you through an approach that will save your aircraft and everyone aboard. The authoritative tone in Maya's voice seemed to cut through Torres' uncertainty, carrying a confidence and technical precision that suggested extensive experience with emergency flight operations. Despite the violation of communication protocols, Torres found herself responding to guidance that felt more competent and detailed than anything she was receiving from official channels. Emergency guidance, executing right turn to 090 and climbing to 8,000 feet. I need constant updates on wind conditions and approach guidance. My number 2 engine is showing increasing signs of failure, and fuel reserves are critical. Maya felt a surge of relief as she heard Torres acknowledge the guidance and begin executing the course correction that would take her away from the most dangerous wind shear zones. Now began the most challenging part of the emergency intervention, guiding a compromised aircraft through weather conditions that exceeded normal safety parameters while maintaining the kind of precise navigation that would require her to reveal the full extent of her capabilities. Mercy 7 Alpha, maintain current heading and altitude. I am showing improved wind conditions at your new position. Reduce airspeed to 140 knots and prepare for a modified approach that will bring you in from the northeast. This approach will require manual navigation procedures that are not in standard emergency protocols. As Maya began providing the detailed technical guidance that Torres needed, she realized that she was crossing a line that would make it impossible to return to her previous anonymity. The precision and authority of her instructions would inevitably raise questions about her identity and qualifications that she would not be able to answer without revealing a past that she had worked hard to conceal. But with 43 lives hanging in the balance, those concerns seemed insignificant compared to the immediate necessity of preventing a catastrophic crash. The old radio equipment hummed with electronic warmth as Maya settled into a rhythm of constant communication with Torres, providing the kind of detailed flight guidance that required not just Technical knowledge, but also an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior under extreme conditions. Her voice carried across the airwaves with an authority that would soon make everyone listening realize that they were hearing something far beyond routine emergency communication. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back to the quiet anonymity of Specialist Maya Santos. For the next 47 minutes, Maya Santos became someone else entirely. Her voice transmitted through the crackling vacuum tubes of equipment that officially didn't exist, guided Captain Torres through a sequence of maneuvers that defied every standard emergency procedure in military aviation. What unfolded over the emergency frequencies was a masterclass in crisis aviation management that left everyone listening in stunned disbelief. Maya's instructions were delivered with surgical precision, each command timed to the second, each course correction calculated to account for variables that shouldn't have been accessible to someone operating from an abandoned hangar. Mercy 7 Alpha. Reduce power on remaining engines to 65% and initiate a controlled descent to 6,000 feet. The wind patterns at that altitude will provide you with a stable approach corridor that avoids the major shear zones. Maya transmitted, her eyes fixed on weather data that she was somehow interpreting with an accuracy that exceeded the base's. Meteorological equipment. Captain Torres, initially skeptical of following guidance from an unidentified source, found herself increasingly reliant on the mysterious voice that seemed to anticipate every challenge her aircraft encountered. The instruction she was receiving demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that suggested access to navigation systems and weather monitoring capabilities far beyond anything available to standard air traffic control. Emergency guidance. How are you tracking my position with such precision? The course corrections you're providing require real-time radar data that should only be available to tower control. Torres transmitted, even as she executed another course adjustment that brought her aircraft into smoother air. Maya's response carried a confidence that came from years of training that she couldn't acknowledge. Captain, I have access to meteorological data and navigation systems that allow for more precise tracking than standard radar. Focus on flying your aircraft and trust the guidance I'm providing. We're going to bring you home safely. What Torres didn't know was that Maya was performing calculations in her head that would have challenged experienced flight controllers with access to modern computer systems. She was integrating wind speed data, aircraft performance characteristics, fuel consumption rates, and approach geometry, using mental processes that reflected training far beyond anything associated with aircraft maintenance. Every instruction she provided was the result of complex mathematical analysis that she was conducting in real time while monitoring multiple variables simultaneously. Mercy 7 Alpha, you're approaching the critical decision point for final approach. I need you to configure your aircraft for a non-standard landing approach that will compensate for your engine problems and the continuing wind conditions. Lower your landing gear now and reduce airspeed to approach speed plus 20 knots. The guidance Maya was providing required Torres to execute maneuvers that weren't covered in standard 100 to 130 emergency procedures. The approach profile she was describing would bring the aircraft in at an angle and airspeed that violated normal safety protocols. But Maya's instructions were delivered with such technical authority that Torres found herself following them. Despite their unconventional nature, in the control tower at Nellis, the emergency coordination team was listening to the mysterious radio transmissions with growing amazement and concern. Colonel Martinez realized that someone with extraordinary flight expertise was providing guidance that exceeded anything his official controllers could offer. But the source of the transmissions remained completely unknown. Attempts to identify the radio operator had failed, and the frequency being used was one that shouldn't have been accessible to unauthorized personnel. Sir, whoever is providing that guidance knows more about emergency approach procedures than anyone on our staff. Controller Martinez reported to Colonel Martinez. The instructions are technically sound, but they're based on navigation principles that require years of advanced training to understand. I've never heard emergency guidance delivered with that level of precision and authority. Maya continued. Her detailed communication with Torres, walking her through each phase of the approach with instructions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of C-130 performance characteristics under adverse conditions. She was providing guidance that accounted for the aircraft's compromised engine status, the varying wind conditions, and the critical medical situation of the passengers in ways that suggested comprehensive understanding of all aspects of the emergency. Captain, you're now 3 miles from touchdown. Maintain current airspeed and prepare for a crosswind landing that will require constant rudder corrections. The wind is gusting from the southwest at 45 knots, but I'm going to talk you through each adjustment you'll need to make to maintain centerline approach. The technical complexity of Maya's instructions was matched by her calm, authoritative delivery. She was providing the kind of detailed flight coaching that normally required face-to-face interaction between experienced instructors and students, delivering complex navigation guidance through radio communication with a clarity that made it possible for Torres to execute maneuvers she had never attempted before. As Mercy 7 Alpha descended through the final phase of approach, Maya's guidance became even more precise and demanding. She was calling out wind corrections and power adjustments with split-second timing, demonstrating an ability to predict aircraft behavior that suggested not just theoretical knowledge, but extensive practical experience with emergency flight operations. Mercy 7 Alpha, you're entering ground defect now. Reduce power to idle on remaining engines and prepare for touchdown. The crosswind is going to try to push you left of centerline, so be ready with right rudder correction. Moment your wheels touch down. What did you think of this thrilling journey? Share your favorite moment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest dailies. What kind of story would you like to hear next? The landing that followed was a testament to both Torres' skill as a pilot and Maya's extraordinary guidance capabilities. Despite the severe weather conditions and mechanical problems, the C-130 touched down with precision that would have been impressive under normal circumstances. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the runway as emergency vehicles raced to provide assistance, and 43 wounded soldiers who had been minutes away from potential disaster were now safely on the ground. The immediate aftermath of the successful landing was chaotic, with medical personnel rushing to transfer the wounded soldiers to hospital facilities, while maintenance crews prepared to assess the aircraft's condition. But in the control tower, Colonel Martinez was focused on a different priority, identifying the mysterious voice that had just executed what would later be described as one of the most technically brilliant emergency guidance operations in modern military aviation history. I want to know who was providing that guidance and how they gained access to emergency communication frequencies, Martinez ordered his staff. Whoever was on that radio demonstrated flight expertise that exceeds anyone on this base. This was not routine emergency assistance. This was something extraordinary. Captain Torres, still shaken from her ordeal but grateful for the successful outcome, was adamant in her debriefing that the mysterious guidance had saved her aircraft and everyone aboard. Colonel, I've been flying C-130s for 8 years, and I've never received emergency guidance of that caliber. Whoever was on that radio knew things about emergency procedures that aren't in any manual I've ever read. Without that assistance, we would have crashed. The investigation into the source of the transmissions began immediately, with technical specialists tracing the radio signals to determine their origin. What they discovered was puzzling. The transmissions had originated from inside the base, specifically from the area of Hangar 7, a facility that was supposed to contain only decommissioned equipment and spare parts. Meanwhile, Maya Santos was systematically shutting down the radio equipment that had allowed her to save 43 lives. Her hands moved with the same practiced efficiency she had shown while providing the emergency guidance, powering down systems and covering equipment with the same care she brought to all her technical work. But she knew that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to end. The precision and authority she had displayed during the emergency guidance session would raise questions that she couldn't answer without revealing capabilities and training that were inconsistent with her official role as a maintenance specialist. The mathematical complexity of the navigation guidance she had provided, combined with her intimate knowledge of C-130 performance characteristics and emergency procedures, would inevitably lead to inquiries about her background and qualifications. As Maya prepared to leave Hangar 7, she realized that she had just crossed a line that would make it impossible to return to her previous existence. The quiet maintenance specialist who had spent 3 years blending into the background of Nellis Air Force Base had just demonstrated expertise that would force her to confront a past she had worked hard to conceal. The 43 lives she had saved came at the cost of the anonymity that had protected her for so long. The investigation that would follow would reveal not just her identity, but also the extraordinary circumstances that had led her to possess the kind of advanced flight training that she had just demonstrated. Maya Santos was about to discover that some purposes cannot be denied forever, and that the skills and knowledge she had tried to suppress would ultimately define her in ways she had never anticipated. The successful emergency landing of Mercy 7 Alpha would be remembered as a remarkable demonstration of aviation expertise under impossible conditions. But the mystery of who had provided the guidance would lead to revelations that would astonish everyone at Nellis Air Force Base and beyond. The investigation began at 0600 hours the morning after the emergency landing, with Colonel Martinez personally leading a team of security specialists and communications experts to Hangar 7. What they discovered in the dusty, supposedly abandoned building would challenge everything they thought they knew about their personnel and the capabilities hidden within their own installation. The radio equipment that Maya had used was vintage military communication gear from the 1980s, vacuum tube technology that had been officially decommissioned years ago, but remained fully functional and capable of accessing frequency bands that modern digital systems couldn't reach. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, the communications specialist who had traced the transmissions, stood amid the equipment with an expression of professional bewilderment. "Sir, this gear shouldn't even be operational. These vacuum tube radios were retired from active service over a decade ago, but someone has been maintaining them in perfect working condition. More than that, they've been modified with antenna configurations that would require extensive knowledge of radio frequency engineering." Colonel Martinez examined the radio setup with growing amazement, noting the precision with which the equipment had been arranged and the obvious expertise required to operate such complex vintage systems. The frequency settings were still dialed to the emergency bands that had been used during the previous night's crisis, and the antenna adjustments showed a level of technical sophistication that went far beyond routine maintenance procedures. "What I don't understand," Martinez said, "is how someone gained access to this building and how they knew these frequencies would be monitored by aircraft in distress. This isn't just technical knowledge. This is operational expertise that requires years of specialized training." The security footage from the perimeter of Hangar 7 proved even more puzzling. Cameras showed Maya Santos entering the building at 18:52 hours, approximately 10 minutes before the first emergency transmissions began. But what the footage couldn't explain was how a maintenance specialist had possessed the advanced radio operating skills and flight expertise necessary to provide the kind of guidance that had saved Mercy 7 Alpha. Her personnel file showed number flight training, no communication specialization, and no background that would explain her extraordinary capabilities. When Maya was summoned to Colonel Martinez's office for questioning, she arrived in her standard maintenance coveralls, her demeanor calm and composed despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. She sat across from Martinez with the same quiet dignity she had always displayed. But there was something different in her eyes, a sense of resignation mixed with relief, as if a burden she had carried for years was finally about to be lifted. Specialist Santos, Martinez began. Last night you provided emergency flight guidance that saved 43 lives using equipment and expertise that you're not supposed to possess. I need you to explain how a maintenance specialist acquired the kind of advanced aviation knowledge that you demonstrated during that emergency. Maya looked at Martinez for a long moment before reaching into her pocket and placing something on his desk that made him freeze in recognition. It was a pilot's wings pin, but not the standard wings worn by current Air Force pilots. These were Navy wings, gold metal that had been worn smooth by years of handling, with a design that Martinez recognized as belonging to test pilot programs from the early 2000s. Colonel, Maya said quietly, my name is Maya Santos now, but I used to be Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos, United States Navy. I was a test pilot assigned to experimental aircraft programs at Naval Air Station Patuxent River until 2009. The revelation hit Martinez like a physical blow. Test pilots represented the elite of military aviation, individuals selected for their exceptional flying skills and technical knowledge. The training required to become a test pilot was among the most demanding in military aviation, involving not just advanced flight skills but also extensive education in aeronautical engineering, experimental procedures, and emergency management techniques that went far beyond standard pilot training. Test pilot training would certainly explain the expertise you demonstrated last night, Martinez said, but it doesn't explain why you're serving as a maintenance specialist at Nellis instead of flying aircraft. What happened to your Navy career? Maya's expression grew distant as she prepared to reveal the events that had ended her flying career and led her to create a new identity as an enlisted maintenance worker. The story she was about to tell would explain not just her extraordinary capabilities, but also the personal tragedy that had driven her to abandon everything she had worked for in pursuit of a different kind of service. In 2009, I was the primary test pilot for an experimental unmanned aircraft program called Project Nighthawk. We were developing autonomous flight systems that could operate in conditions too dangerous for human pilots. The program was highly classified, involving aircraft that could theoretically fly reconnaissance missions in hostile territory without risking human lives. Martinez leaned forward, recognizing that he was hearing about classified programs that few people outside the intelligence community would have known about. Test pilot assignments to experimental aircraft programs often involve technologies that remain secret for decades, and Maya's casual reference to autonomous flight systems suggested involvement in cutting-edge research that was still classified. During a test flight over the Pacific, we encountered a situation that had never been accounted for in our experimental protocols. A massive storm system developed faster than our meteorological predictions, creating conditions that overwhelmed the autonomous flight systems. The unmanned aircraft began to fail, and we were losing a prototype that represented years of development and millions of dollars in research. Maya paused, and Martinez could see the weight of memory in her expression as she relived events that had clearly defined the rest of her life. The technical details she was describing suggested involvement in programs that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology, the kind of experimental work that required not just exceptional flying skills, but also the ability to make split-second decisions about untested systems. I violated direct orders and took manual control of the aircraft remotely, using experimental control systems that hadn't been fully tested. For 43 minutes, I flew that aircraft through conditions that should have been impossible, bringing it back to base using navigation techniques that existed only in theoretical studies. I saved the aircraft and preserved years of research, but I also demonstrated that human operators could outperform the autonomous systems we were supposed to be testing. The implications of what Maya was describing began to dawn on Martinez. Her unauthorized intervention had not only saved valuable experimental aircraft, but had also undermined the fundamental premise of the research program she was assigned to. By proving that human pilots could succeed where autonomous systems failed, she had essentially invalidated the direction of an entire experimental program. The investigation that followed determined that my actions, while technically successful, had compromised the integrity of the experimental program. I had proven that the autonomous systems we were developing were inadequate, but I had done so by violating safety protocols and exceeding my operational authority. The program was canceled, and I was facing court-martial proceedings for insubordination and violation of experimental flight protocols. Maya's voice carried no bitterness as she described the end of her Navy career, but Martinez could hear the pain of someone who had sacrificed everything she had worked for in service of a principle she couldn't abandon. The choice she had made to save the experimental aircraft had cost her not just her career, but also her identity as a naval aviator. I was given the option of facing court-martial or accepting administrative separation from the Navy with the understanding that my involvement in classified programs would prevent me from working in civilian aviation. I chose separation, but the conditions included restrictions on my ability to use my pilot qualifications in any official capacity. The revelation explained why Maya had been working as a maintenance specialist despite possessing qualifications that exceeded those of most pilots on the base. Her separation from the Navy had effectively ended her ability to fly professionally, but it hadn't eliminated her knowledge or her instinctive responses to aviation emergencies. The expertise she had demonstrated the previous night represented years of training that she could no longer officially use. After my separation, I spent 2 years working civilian jobs that had nothing to do with aviation, trying to build a life that didn't involve aircraft. But I couldn't stay away. The Air Force offered me the opportunity to enlist as maintenance personnel, which allowed me to stay close to aircraft without violating the terms of my separation agreement. Martinez realized that he was looking at someone who had sacrificed a prestigious military career for the principle that human judgment and expertise should not be subordinated to untested technology. Maya's willingness to violate orders to save an experimental aircraft had cost her everything she had worked for, but it had also demonstrated the kind of character that led her to risk her anonymity to save 43 wounded soldiers. Last night, when I heard Captain Torres struggling with conditions that exceeded standard emergency procedures, I couldn't stand by and let people die because of inadequate guidance. I knew that the approach being planned would fail, and I knew that I had the expertise to provide better guidance. The cost of helping was revealing who I really am, but that seemed insignificant compared to the lives at stake. The quiet dignity with which Maya described her choices impressed Martinez more than any display of military bearing could have. She had given up a career that most pilots could only dream of, then spent years working in anonymity rather than seeking recognition for her exceptional qualifications. When circumstances demanded it, she had risked everything she had built to save lives, accepting that her intervention would end the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for years. "Specialist Santos," Martinez said formally, "the expertise you demonstrated last night represents capabilities that this base needs and that the Air Force should recognize. I'm recommending you for immediate officer candidate school and reinstatement to flight status. Your actions saved 43 lives using skills that took years to develop." Maya shook her head with the same quiet determination that had defined her military service. "Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for recognition or career advancement. I'm content with my current role. What happened last night was necessary, but it doesn't change what I want to do with my life." The humility of her response surprised Martinez, who had expected someone with her qualifications to welcome the opportunity for advancement and recognition. Instead, Maya Santos seemed genuinely committed to continuing her work as a maintenance specialist, Serving in a capacity that utilized only a fraction of her capabilities, her choice to remain in an enlisted maintenance role despite possessing qualifications that exceeded most officers on the base represented a level of selflessness that Martinez had rarely encountered in his military career. Maya Santos's story spread throughout Nellis Air Force Base with the quiet intensity of a whispered legend, transforming her from an invisible maintenance specialist into something approaching myth. Word of the former test pilot who had hidden among the enlisted ranks, content to work in anonymity until 43 lives hung in the balance, reached every corner of the installation within days. Yet Maya herself seemed determined to return to the ordinary routine that had defined her existence for the past 3 years, as if the extraordinary events of that stormy night had been an aberration rather than a revelation of her true capabilities. Wounded soldiers who had been aboard Mercy 7 Alpha began to learn the identity of the voice that had guided them safely through impossible conditions. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the flight nurse who had struggled to keep her patients stable during the terrifying approach, made a point of visiting Maya at her maintenance station to express gratitude that transcended military protocol. "You saved us all," Walsh said simply, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen death approaching and been pulled back from the brink by expertise that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Captain Torres, whose piloting skills had been tested beyond anything in her training, requested permission to meet the person who had provided the guidance that made her successful landing possible. When she finally encountered Maya in the maintenance bay, Torres was struck by the contrast between the quiet, unassuming specialist and the authoritative voice that had commanded her complete attention during the emergency. "I've been flying for 8 years," Torres told Maya, "and I've never received guidance of that caliber. You didn't just save my aircraft, you taught me things about flying that I never knew were possible." The recognition that Maya received from the people whose lives she had directly affected carried a weight that official commendations could never match. These were not bureaucratic acknowledgments of technical competence, but personal expressions of gratitude from individuals who understood that they owed their survival to someone who had risked everything to help them. Yet Maya responded to each expression of thanks with the same quiet dignity, deflecting credit and emphasizing that she had simply done what circumstances required. Colonel Martinez found himself facing a personnel situation unlike anything in his command experience. Military regulations provided no clear guidance for managing someone with Maya's extraordinary qualifications who insisted on serving in a capacity far below her capabilities. The Air Force needed test pilots, needed people with her expertise. In emergency procedures, needed officers with her combination of technical knowledge and practical experience. But Maya's insistence on remaining in her maintenance role created a situation that challenged conventional approaches to personnel management. The story of Maya Santos began to resonate beyond the boundaries of Nellis Air Force Base as news of the remarkable emergency landing spread throughout military aviation communities. The technical details of the guidance she had provided were analyzed by flight safety experts who marveled at the precision and innovation of her approach procedures. Aviation journals requested interviews, seeking to understand how someone with test pilot credentials had remained unknown while serving as enlisted maintenance personnel. Maya declined all interview requests, all offers of recognition, all opportunities to capitalize on the attention her actions had generated. Her response to fame was the same as her response to anonymity: quiet competence focused on the work immediately in front of her. She continued to arrive at the maintenance bay at 0530 each morning, continued to perform routine inspections and equipment checks with the same methodical precision that had characterized her service for 3 years. Yet, something fundamental had changed in how others perceived and interacted with Maya Santos. Maintenance personnel who had previously seen her as simply another specialist now approached her with questions that reflected awareness of her extraordinary background. Pilots who had once barely acknowledged her existence began seeking her input on technical issues, recognizing that her perspective carried insights that extended far beyond routine maintenance procedures. The transformation in Maya's professional relationships reflected broader questions about how military institutions identify and utilize exceptional talent. Her story highlighted the limitations of systems that categorize personnel based on formal qualifications rather than actual capabilities, suggesting that extraordinary expertise might be hidden throughout military organizations in ways that official records couldn't detect. Maya's choice to remain in her maintenance role, despite offers of advancement and recognition, represented a philosophy of service that prioritized purpose over prestige. She had found meaning in work that kept her close to aircraft without the pressures and responsibilities of command, discovering satisfaction in contributing to aviation safety through meticulous attention to technical details rather than high-profile flight operations. The wounded soldiers whose lives she had saved began to stay in contact with Maya, creating an informal network of people who understood that they shared a connection forged in moments of life and death crisis. Their expressions of gratitude evolved into ongoing relationships that provided Maya with a sense of community she had not experienced since leaving the Navy. These relationships were based not on rank or position but on the shared understanding of what it meant to face impossible circumstances and emerge safely through collective effort and expertise. As months passed, Maya Santos became a symbol of hidden heroism at Nellis Air Force Base, representing the idea that extraordinary capabilities often exist in unexpected places among seemingly ordinary people. Her story challenged assumptions about leadership, expertise, and recognition, suggesting that the most valuable contributions to military missions might come from individuals who seek no credit for their actions. The legacy of that stormy night, when Maya guided Mercy 7 Alpha to safety, extended beyond the immediate rescue to encompass broader questions about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of people who choose purpose over recognition. Her willingness to risk her carefully constructed anonymity to save 43 lives demonstrated that true strength often manifests not in seeking glory but in accepting responsibility when circumstances demand action. Maya Santos continued her work in the maintenance bay, her hands still caring for aircraft with the same precision and dedication that had defined her service from the beginning. But now her colleagues understood that those hands had once controlled experimental aircraft through impossible conditions, and that the quiet specialist checking engine components possessed knowledge and experience that represented the pinnacle of aviation expertise. Her story had become part of the institutional memory of Nellis Air Force Base, a reminder that heroes often walk among us, their courage a quiet, unyielding force forever bound by their commitment to protecting others regardless of personal cost. 6 months after the emergency landing that had revealed her true identity, Maya Santos had settled into a routine that acknowledged her extraordinary past while honoring her commitment to quiet service. The maintenance bay at Nellis Air Force Base had become something of a pilgrimage site for young airmen and pilots who sought to understand how someone with test pilot credentials could find fulfillment in routine technical work. Maya received these visitors with the same patient dignity she brought to all her interactions, answering questions about aviation principles while carefully avoiding details about classified programs that had defined her Navy career. The relationship between Maya and Captain Torres had evolved into something approaching mentorship, with Torres regularly visiting the maintenance bay to discuss flight techniques and emergency procedures. During one of these conversations, Torres mentioned that she had been selected for advanced training at the Air Force Test Pilot School, an opportunity that would have been impossible without the confidence and technical knowledge she had gained during their shared emergency experience. "I keep thinking about that night," Torres told Maya as they examined a C-130 engine component. "The way you guided me through maneuvers that weren't in any manual I'd ever read. You taught me that flying isn't just about following procedures. It's about understanding aircraft as living systems that respond to conditions in ways that can't always be predicted. Maya nodded, her hands continuing their methodical inspection of the engine part. Test pilot school will teach you to think beyond standard procedures. You'll learn to push aircraft to their limits safely, to understand their capabilities in ways that routine flying never reveals. That kind of knowledge changes how you approach every aspect of aviation. The conversation reflected the subtle influence that Maya had begun to exert throughout Nellis Air Force Base. Her technical insights had improved maintenance procedures. Her emergency response expertise had enhanced safety protocols. And her philosophical approach to service had influenced how others thought about their roles within the military structure. Yet she continued to resist all attempts to formalize her contributions through promotion or recognition. Colonel Martinez had eventually stopped trying to convince Maya to accept officer candidacy, recognizing that her commitment to enlisted service represented a choice rather than a limitation. Instead, he had quietly arranged for her to receive additional responsibilities that utilized her expertise, without changing her official rank or position. Maya now served as an unofficial consultant on emergency procedures, her input sought by flight safety investigators and training personnel who valued her unique perspective on aviation crisis management. The wounded soldiers from Mercy 7 Alpha had maintained contact with Maya, their gratitude evolving into genuine friendships that transcended military hierarchy. Staff Sergeant Walsh had been promoted to flight nurse instructor, a position that allowed her to share lessons learned during that terrifying night with new medical personnel. She frequently told her students about the mysterious voice that had guided their aircraft to safety, emphasizing that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources during crisis situations. The person who saved us wasn't a controller or a pilot, Walsh would explain to her classes. She was a maintenance specialist who happened to possess knowledge that exceeded everyone else's capabilities. It taught me that we should never assume we know the full extent of what our colleagues can contribute, especially during emergencies. Maya's story had become part of the institutional culture at Nellis, referenced in training programs and safety briefings as an example of how individual initiative and hidden expertise could make the difference between tragedy and triumph. Yet the woman at the center of this legend continued to approach each day with the same quiet focus on routine technical work that had characterized her service from the beginning. The old radio equipment in Hangar 7 had been officially decommissioned and removed, but Maya had been granted permission to maintain a small communication station in the maintenance bay. She used this equipment to monitor emergency frequencies during her off-duty hours, providing unofficial backup support for aircraft experiencing difficulties. Her assistance remained invisible to most people involved, but pilots who had received her guidance during challenging situations began to recognize the distinctive calm authority of her voice. One evening, as Maya was conducting routine maintenance on a fighter aircraft, she was approached by a young airman who had recently arrived at Nellis. The airman, whose name tag read Rodriguez, carried himself with the nervous energy of someone still adjusting to military life, but his questions about aircraft systems demonstrated genuine technical curiosity. "Specialist Santos," Rodriguez said, "I've heard stories about you around the base. People say you used to be a test pilot, that you saved 43 people during a storm. I wanted to ask you about something that's been bothering me." Maya paused in her work, giving Rodriguez the same patient attention she offered to all questions about aviation. "What's on your mind, Rodriguez?" "Well, I joined the Air Force because I wanted to fly, but I didn't qualify for pilot training. I've been assigned to maintenance, and some people act like that's a consolation prize, like I'm settling for something less important. But after hearing about what you did, I'm wondering if maybe I'm looking at this wrong." Maya set down her tools and looked at Rodriguez with an expression that combined understanding with quiet conviction. Rodriguez, there's something you need to understand about military aviation. Every aircraft that leaves the ground safely does. So because maintenance personnel like you have ensured that every system is functioning properly. Pilots get the recognition, but maintenance crews make flight possible. She gestured toward the fighter aircraft they were working on, her voice taking on the teaching tone she used when explaining complex concepts. This aircraft will fly missions that could save lives, defend freedom, or gather intelligence that prevents conflicts. Your work on these systems is directly connected to those outcomes. The difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure often depends on the attention to detail that maintenance personnel bring to their work. Rodriguez nodded, but Maya could see that he was still processing the implications of what she was telling him. She continued, her voice carrying the weight of experience that had taught her to value substance over recognition. I spent years flying experimental aircraft, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. It was exciting, challenging, and professionally rewarding. But I found just as much satisfaction in maintenance work because I understand how it connects to the bigger picture. Every bolt I tighten, every system I inspect, every component I repair contributes to the safety and success of people who depend on these aircraft. The conversation with Rodriguez reflected thousands of similar interactions Maya had experienced since her identity became known. Young airmen sought her out, not just for technical knowledge, but for perspective on how to find meaning in military service regardless of their official roles. Her example suggested that fulfillment came not from position or recognition but from understanding how individual contributions connected to larger purposes. As the months passed, Maya's influence extended beyond Nellis Air Force Base through the network of people whose lives she had touched. Captain Torres, now in test pilot training, shared Maya's philosophy of service with her fellow students. Staff Sergeant Walsh incorporated lessons about hidden expertise into her medical training programs. The wounded soldiers from Mercy 7 Alpha carried stories of the quiet hero who had saved them back to their home units, spreading awareness of how extraordinary capabilities could exist in unexpected places. Maya Santos had become more than a maintenance specialist or even a former test pilot. She had become a symbol of the idea that heroism often manifests in quiet dedication rather than public recognition, that the most valuable contributions to military missions frequently come from people who seek no credit for their actions. Her story challenged conventional assumptions about leadership, expertise, and recognition, suggesting that true strength was measured not by rank or position, but by willingness to act when circumstances demanded it. The legacy of that stormy night when Maya guided Mercy 7 Alpha to safety continued to influence how people throughout the military thought about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of individuals who choose purpose over prestige. Her willingness to risk her carefully constructed anonymity to save 43 lives had demonstrated that some callings transcend personal interest, that the most profound acts of service often receive no official recognition but create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate impact. In the maintenance bay at Nellis Air Force Base, Maya Santos continued her work with aircraft, her hands still caring for the machines that carried people safely through dangerous skies. But now her colleagues understood that those hands had once controlled experimental aircraft through impossible conditions, and that the quiet specialist checking engine components possessed knowledge and experience that represented the pinnacle of aviation expertise. Her story had become part of the institutional memory of military aviation, a reminder that heroes often walk among us, their courage a quiet, unyielding force forever bound by their commitment to protecting others regardless of personal cost. The true measure of Maya Santos's impact could not be found in official records or commendations, but in the changed perspectives of people who had learned from her example that service was not about seeking recognition but about contributing to purposes larger than oneself. Her legacy lived on in the improved safety procedures that reflected her insights, in the enhanced emergency response capabilities that incorporated her innovations, and in the countless individuals who had been inspired by her demonstration. That extraordinary contributions could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, Maya Santos had proven that sometimes the most important heroism is the kind that no one sees coming. Performed by people who ask for nothing in return except the opportunity to make a difference when it matters most, ready to be inspired by more. Incredible stories of hidden heroes and extraordinary courage. Maya Santos's remarkable journey from decorated test pilot to anonymous maintenance specialist to life-saving guardian angel reminds us that heroism often wears the most ordinary disguises. Her story proves that the person working quietly beside you might possess capabilities that could change everything when the moment demands it. What hidden talents do you carry? What extraordinary potential lies dormant in the people around you? If Maya's story moved you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to join our community of people who believe that the most powerful stories are often the ones that never make headlines. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their contributions matter, regardless of recognition. Drop a comment below. Have you ever encountered someone whose hidden expertise surprised you? What would you do if you possessed life-saving skills, but had to remain anonymous? Next week, we're bringing you the incredible story of a janitor whose mathematical genius helped solve a problem that had stumped MIT professors for decades. Won't want to miss it. Remember, true heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear work uniforms and carry the quiet strength to change the world when it matters most.